Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Southern Economic Development Council webcast series. This is a series of webinars designed to connect and inform the people shaping the future of our region and also the nation's economy. So I'm Matt Tackett. I'm president of the Southern Economic Development Council. We're a 17-state membership association representing and serving economic developers in the American South. That's a region, when taken together, stands as the world's third largest equivalent economy. So today's episode is Policies, Trade, and the Future of U.S. Investment. This is built in partnership with our great friends at Global Location Strategies, and this brings together a really outstanding panel of national experts to explore how shifting policies, global trade trends, and investment patterns are influencing growth, opportunity, and ultimately competitiveness across the United States and also the American South for sure. So I am really thrilled and honored to introduce our world-class speakers here. So first is our friend Nichollette Ross from Global Location Strategies, who will moderate today's show. She is managing site selection consultant. She at Global Location Strategies, she advises companies on making informed location strategy decisions that drive growth and success. She also manages the GLS European office. She's in Paris today. Um, and oversees international business development initiatives for the firm. She brings a unique international perspective to location strategy, having worked overseas in Europe for the South Carolina Department of Commerce at SC Commerce European office in Munich. She advised across 13 countries or companies across 13 countries on opening a facility in the US and assisted with that process. She holds a dual bachelor's degrees in marketing and management and an international MBA from Florida International University. She is fluent in or conversational in Spanish and Mandarin Chinese. Next, we are thrilled to welcome Charles Crain to the webcast. Charles is the Managing Vice President of Policy at the National Association of Manufacturers, where he leads a team of policy experts and advocates working to advance legislative and regulatory outcomes that support growth and competitiveness across the United States for manufacturers. Previously, Charles served as the Vice President of Domestic Policy at NAM, overseeing the association's work on tax, corporate governance, healthcare, and technology. He originally joined NAM to build and lead its policy portfolio on corporate governance, financial services, and capital markets, engaging closely with the Securities and Exchange Commission. Before joining NAM, Charles worked with the Biotechnology Innovation Organization on financial services, tax, and healthcare issues, and began his career on Capitol Hill, supporting the House Financial Services and Senate Finance Committees. Charles is also a Southerner, along with us, as a native of Birmingham in Alabama. We also have Hunter Voegele with us. Hunter is a managing director in the Global Strategic Advisory practice at Ankura, specializing in federal and state incentives, project finance, and strategic advisory services. He guides clients through complex investment landscapes in the U.S. and abroad, with experience spanning more than $2 billion in capital investment projects. Hunter has helped secure over $370 million in federal grants and tax credits and negotiated more than $350 million in state incentives across the country, with a focus on the Southeast and the Midwest. His work centers on maximizing community and commercial impact through strategic partnerships and effective use of incentive programs. Hunter is also an Alabaman native as well, and he graduated from Amherst College, and he is based in DC. And finally, needs no introduction here, it's our friend Didi Caldwell, known as the Factory Whisperer. Didi is the president and CEO of Global Location Strategies, where she sets the firm's strategic direction and ensures its mission to match companies and communities with mutual sustainable prosperity. Under her leadership, GLS has become a global leader in site selection and incentive negotiation, earning a spot on the Inc. 5,000 fastest growing companies list twice. With more than 2 decades of experience guiding major manufacturing and industrial projects, Didi led the spin out of GLS from Fluor, where she began her career after a formative internship in Buenos Aires, Argentina. Didi is a founding member and past chair of the Site Selectors Guild, where she now leads the Ready Sites initiative. Her leadership has earned recognition among the 50 most influential people by Greenville Business Magazine, the Groundbreaker Award from Groundbreaker Carolinas, and SC Biz News Women of Influence honor. She holds a bachelor's degree in architecture from Clemson and international MBA from the University of South Carolina's Darla Moore School of Business. So we are so very honored to welcome our panelists. Let me finally say, Upon conclusion of our discussion, if time allows and we expect it to, we'll open the forum up for questions. So we'd love to see you. Don't be afraid to turn your camera on and we'll have a family chat with our experts here. You can also pop some questions in the chat along the way. So, and also as we are recording this session, it will be made available to all in the coming days. So with that said, I'm happy to turn the session over to my good friend, Nichollette. Nichollette, thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Matt, and good morning, everyone. We are really excited to get things kicked off, and thank you again to each of the panelists. I know you all are going to have some very insightful comments over the course of this hour. And so just so everyone knows, today we're going to explore 4 key topics that I believe are important to really understand in order to plan for the future, whether you're a private company, economic developer, or someone within this ecosystem. So we'll talk a little bit about how policies are influencing investment decisions, the dynamics around trade and tariffs impacting supply chains and cost structures, opportunities when it comes to incentives and permitting strategies, and then strategies for workforce development and site readiness. And so we all here know that there has been a shift in the approach to policies, and companies and communities are working to navigate the best way to approach the market. And so it's not that policy changes are unheard of by any means, but just the frequency of those changes and the ever-evolving dynamics have made uncertainty kind of the buzzword of the year. But what really has led to this shift that we're seeing now? Let's dig into that a little bit first. Maybe Charles, can you talk a little bit about kind of, how we've gotten to where we are today?
Absolutely. Thanks, Nichollette. It's great to be with y'all this morning. As Matthew said, I'm a native Southerner, so it's always great to be back with family. And it's always great time to talk about policy here at the NAM, the National Association of Manufacturers. Our sole job really here in DC is to seek to effectuate a positive policy environment for manufacturing investment across the country, which of course includes in the 17 states that SCDC covers in the South. So really excited to talk about exactly what those dynamics are, present tense, and where we see things going in the coming months and years. So to take a step back, as Nichollette said, we know that manufacturers and businesses of all stripes are experiencing significant policy uncertainty. Not unheard of, first year of a new administration and a new Congress, but certainly the pace of policymaking we know has been extreme for companies to deal with and to plan around, especially as you're thinking about long-term investments, which is, of course, critical to the success of any business. So the way I try to think about it is that the current policy environment, the new policies driven by the administration and the Congress, can really be divided into significant opportunities for the business community where we've seen real progress in areas that should support, incentivize, and drive investment and job creation here in the U.S., as well as some challenges where there are still some questions to be answered about what is the impact going to be on investment in the business community and where it actually might make it more difficult to invest. On the opportunity side, to start out, President Trump campaigned on renewing and preserving his historic win from his first term, which is to say the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. The TCJA, tax reform, reformed the tax code for the first time in 30 years and really made the U.S. a attractive home for global investment, which had not been the case previously. Just as one data point, our corporate rate had been at 35%, the highest in the OECD and the third highest in the entire world. TCJA reduces the corporate rate down to 21%, as well as makes a host of other pro-investment, pro-business, pro-manufacturing policy changes. Many of the TCJA provisions were up for expiration at the end of 2025. The president and Congress came together, passed the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, which was signed into law by the president on July 4th, which really should unlock significant investment across the business community. In addition to the 21% corporate rate and the competitive rates for pass-through businesses, which 90+% of American businesses are organized as pass-throughs, so it's actually the individual side of the tax code rather than the corporate side, which is most relevant to them. So in addition to those kind of baseline pro-growth tax policies, there's specific incentives for research and development, new factory construction, capital equipment purchases. These are pro-growth activities that drive investment across industry. And so the fact that that bill was signed into law in the first half of this year, if you count those 4 days into July, part of the first half of the year anyway, I think should really be a boon to business. We didn't have to wait for the December 31st expiration of so much of the tax code. That applies in the regulatory space as well. The administration has made significant investments in right-sizing the federal regulatory environment. Across the business community coming into this administration, we shouldered collectively about $3 trillion in federal regulatory cost every year. Of course, businesses need reliable rules of the road. I don't think anyone on the phone is anti-regulation, but certainly the degree to which the regulatory environment was burdening businesses at $3 trillion a year was really damaging our growth and investment ability. And so this administration's commitment to right-sizing and rebalancing that federal regulatory burden, we think it's a tremendous opportunity to drive additional investment and growth. And that should continue in the future as they continue to work through their regulatory agenda. Specifically, and I know Didi is an expert on this, permitting, I know, is such an issue for so many businesses. Permitting reform to enable businesses to get permits quicker, to get shovels in the ground faster, to reduce legal uncertainty, potential for delays throughout the course of getting a project off the ground. That's on the docket for this administration, these agencies, and this Congress. So we should see additional future opportunities to right-size the barriers to growth that many businesses are facing. On a going forward basis, though, we do continue to see challenges. I know some of those we want to talk about today, including in the trade space. Manufacturers certainly support, and I think this is probably true for businesses across the spectrum, the president's goal of incentivizing and supporting domestic business investment, including and especially in the manufacturing sector, which is where I'm coming from, but this is true across the business community. But the fact remains that we do still need access to inputs from elsewhere to make those investments that we want to see and that the president wants to see. So to the extent that there are cost increases on some of those inputs, whether they are resources, critical minerals, energy resources, as well as specialized equipment and machinery that may not yet be made at scale here in the United States, to the extent there's cost increases on those items or uncertainty around whether there's going to be cost increases on those items, that can create sort of slowing of the investment decisions that we want to see to drive American economic activity. So we know that that's going to be a critical focus for many of you on the line to navigate that uncertainty. And how do we illustrate the impacts of some of those cost increases in a way that still allows manufacturers and other businesses to invest? That's going to be critically important, sort of looking into our crystal ball, as USMCA, the United States-Mexico-Canada Trade Agreement, comes up for reconsideration next year in 2026. The conversations that we're all having around the North American co-production model and where inputs are really coming from is going to be critically important as we approach that USMCA conversation. And it's going to be incumbent on all of us to think through what are those impacts and how do we be sure that we're communicating the opportunities and as well as the challenges that the current policy environment is creating for the business community. So I'll stop there. I know we're going to get deep in the weeds on a lot of those individual topics, but I just wanted to stage set that we know, and not to speak for my fellow panelists, but we know you're all facing that uncertainty and excited to talk through exactly what the implications of that are today.
Yeah, and I guess just taking a little bit of a step back in terms of what that uncertainty is right now. To your point, Charles, it seems that there are certainly some of the puzzle pieces being put together that will help drive investment in the future. But today, we're seeing that it's impacting some of the different investment decisions or existing locations as well. And so when thinking about how EDOs, for instance, can help to mitigate some of that uncertainty when attracting different investments to their areas, what are some different tactics that can be used on their side?
I don't know if you're specifically directing that at me or the panel writ large. I can say just from my perspective as a sort of DC person, what I have heard so much from the business community, and I think EDOs can play a critical role in this, it's just that information sharing of what is coming down the pike, what can businesses be planning around, what are the sort of drop dead dates for some of these policies. Some of the tax policies are actually retroactive, which is great because we can take advantage of those benefits, but folks need to know that so they can do it. As we get new regulations coming down the pike in the tax space and the regulatory space and the permitting space, how do you take advantage of those? How do you rely on these new incentives to drive investment, even when there may be some barriers to investment, as we've discussed? maybe in the trade space, there are ways to get around and navigate those. So in my view, EDOs can really play an information sharing role to help companies understand what the actual status quo is and what it might be in the future so that they can make company by company investment decisions based on that information.
Hmm.
Yeah, and I think from our side, when we're working with corporations, the range of possibilities that we're having to model has definitely increased exponentially because we don't know what the tariff level is going to be next week, much less 4 or 5 years or 10, 25 years from now. So economic developers can also be doing that on their side. But I also think that I'm maybe wandering in a little bit into Hunter's space, so he might be able to pick this up and run with it. But I think what we're seeing is that the federal government, in a way that it hasn't previously, is much more involved in these investment decisions. So when they started Select USA under the Obama administration, that was the first time we really saw the US government engaging in trying to proactively attract manufacturing or just generally investment into the United States. Certainly with the Biden administration, we saw the CHIPS Act, the IRA, and these kind of power charge some of these things, and it was more of a carrot. Tariffs, I think, can probably be perceived as a stick, but on the flip side, it also is opportunity to negotiate directly with the government. And this is not just for corporations, it's also for counties and states in order to have money provided to support certain infrastructure projects or even to assist with specific projects. So even if you're impacted by tariffs on one side, there may be another way to make up for any damage that might be done. And I don't think that that's something that's a new paradigm shift for us. So, Hunter, you have a comment on that, or?
No, I totally agree with that. I mean, what I would suggest for EDOs is you're planning ahead with the sites that you have or the projects that you have that may have gaps and being creative or innovative and how you partner with projects to address those big gaps and pursuing the federal opportunities or engaging with the Trump administration or various agencies and how to fill them. I think one thing that we've seen with the federal opportunities or federal funding opportunities is that they are trying to consolidate the number of programs, but broaden out the eligibility so that you can be creative in your request for funding. And oftentimes, I take the Economic Development Administration disaster supplemental that's coming up as a good example. They're requiring public-private partnerships for the larger grant opportunity where you're submitting multiple projects that both support a development project or a project that's being cited in community in addition to workforce programs or a community need. It's something that's, I think they use the example of, you could fund a fire station on one hand, but then also develop infrastructure for a project that you would want to site there and address them, at the same time with the same request. But I do think you are seeing, the question we get every day is, what about the grant programs, the loan programs, the Inflation Reduction Act programs? We're seeing the headlines. There's cancellations, there's pauses, they're freezing all the grant programs. I'm sure many people on this call have experienced that with their projects, whether it's a site being selected or it's a project that they're pursuing themselves on behalf of their community to develop infrastructure. And what I can say is that while this year has been a little bit volatile in that area, I do think that what the Trump administration is doing is clearing the slate, at least from their perspective, of getting rid of some of the projects that were priorities under the Biden administration, bringing some of that money back into the Treasury, reallocating money so that they have a war chest to pursue the next 3 years while Trump is in office, to invest in the areas that they consider strategic priorities. And the extent that you can align with that, align your community needs to that. Like I said, if you need a fire station, we need a fire station because we have a large industrial consumer that's coming into town and we need to get funding for it to support them. That's how I think you'd be successful. And you can plan ahead now in this down zone. A lot of these programs I don't think are going to come open until like March or sort of Q2 of next year, where you can start pursuing those opportunities to come available. But if you don't plan today, you won't be ready whenever they become available.
And Hunter, you touched on a little bit about how there have been some cancellations due to grant programs, but we've also seen some announcements this year as well, even if they are within some of those targeted industries at a national level. Didi, I know you've kind of looked at some of the different ongoing trends in terms of announcements. Can you share any insights around how the overall landscape has still positively impacted and allowed companies to continue moving forward?
It's a little bit difficult. I can talk about the trends and what we're seeing. It's a little bit difficult. Correlation is not the same as causation. So I don't know that we have a real track record of what policies from the Biden administration versus the Trump administration are impacting these numbers, but we do know that they all work in concert together. So in 2024, we had record FDI announcements. There were about 17,600 projects that were announced worldwide. And to date, that activity is around 18%, which is the lowest since 2021. The US has pretty much remained steady in terms of the number of projects that it's capturing, so about 12 to 13%. But global CapEx, so the percentage of announced CapEx that the US is capturing in FDI, has grown from its standard of around 9 or 10% to around 29% in 2025. And the same thing can be said about jobs. So the share of jobs has gone from about 6 to 9% historically to 11% in 2025. And you really wouldn't think of the United States as being like, a place that you would locate if you have, a lot of employment. So even though the number of projects has probably gone down in the US, the CapEx and the jobs announced have gone up significantly. And if you take out, so if we look at all projects, there's been a decrease of about 13%, but manufacturing itself is only down about 2% in the United States. So it's still quite resilient. I think that there's also the other piece that you have to consider here, which is power. And so manufacturing data centers do not count in that manufacturing number. And a lot of the data centers that are being developed are US companies. So it really doesn't impact those FDI statistics. But we'd be remiss not to think about the trillions of dollars that have been announced in the data center infrastructure. And if you look at the United States from a power and an energy perspective, we're by far the most well-positioned country and geography in the world. So I think some of what we're seeing is a mix of policy, but then also this availability of cheap, reliable energy that will be a sustaining advantage regardless of what happens on the power side.
Charles, are you by chance seeing the combination of the two looked at it from your side with some of the companies you work with?
Yeah, excuse me. It's a really great point that Didi raises, the confluence of these various, again, in my world, policy areas, but in y'all's world, business areas. Manufacturers are significant users of energy, right? So we need reliable energy sources, affordable and reliable energy sources. We also are increasingly users of AI, which is, of course, enabled by the data center expansion, right? Modern shop floors are incredibly well interconnected in a way that was not the case 15, 20 years ago. And it's really enabled efficiencies, really increased safety, better supply chain relationships. AI is having this sort of incredible moment in manufacturing. I know people think about like ChatGPT in Silicon Valley, but there are real manufacturing inflection points when it comes to AI. So we need the energy to do sort of traditional manufacturing, but we also need energy to go to the data centers to then empower the AI that manufacturers are also utilizing. And then baked around all this, you also need a reliable grid to send the energy from place to place, and you need permitting to get all the projects off the ground, the manufacturing projects and the data center projects. So I do think there's an increasing awareness of the interconnected nature of all of those dynamics. And to Didi's point, the U.S. is really starting out ahead of the game when it comes to having reliable, affordable sources of energy, when it comes to certainly manufacturing investment here, when it comes to a resilient and reliable grid. We're steps ahead there, but we have to make a decision to continue to invest in that direction. And so that's something certainly the NAM is committed to. In my view, it's something the Trump administration and Congress are committed to. But it's not something that you can do with the snap of your fingers. It requires dedication to ensuring that that Venn diagram of all those issues works as well as possible and that they're all rowing in the same direction, which is to say, of course, supporting and increasing domestic investment.
Mhm. One piece that I would put in that Venn diagram, and that is workforce and talent. And so I know we talk a lot about the constraints on US labor, and we're going through this obvious bubble where there's a lot of baby boomers that are retiring. So that's taking skills and people out of the workforce. We've also got pressure from immigration, not just from the deportations, but also from the fear of deportations. And we've also cut off the stream of immigrants coming to the US. But despite all of that, when you compare us to other rich countries, we still have a relatively robust demography. And the good thing about the United States is that the baby boomers had kids. The next generation, maybe not so much, but we do have sort of this echo boom that's coming. Now, their skills are not nearly as developed and they're not as productive as the baby boomers are currently that are now retiring, but they will get there over time. So that's another thing that I think that companies, communities, the federal government, state governments really need to pay attention to is how to prepare the workforce for this oncoming industrial boom that we're seeing. That, like Charles said, it doesn't happen at the snap of your fingers. It will take some time, but it is definitely coming. The train has left the station and we just need to get on board and be ready for it.
Yeah, I think this is a great point, Didi. We certainly are seeing this in manufacturing. We have about 400,000 open jobs in the sector. So we need workers, period. But we specifically need workers with the skills needed to succeed in 21st century manufacturing. I know so many companies that I talk to are on the front lines of doing that themselves. They have training programs internally, they sponsor apprenticeships, they work with the local community college to develop a curriculum that spits out workers that meets the needs on their shop floor or those in their industry. So we're committed to the project, but you're exactly right, Didi. We need these folks to have the skills they need to succeed. Not everybody needs to be the engineer or the scientist or the, designing the AI program. But if you're a shop floor worker, you need to know how to utilize those inputs and work with your AI companion or whatever the setup is on your shop floor to actually be as productive as you can be. We also were really seeing in manufacturing anyway, a need for manufacturing specific skills. So technician, welder, machinist, electrician. These are critical skills that make manufacturing work, and we just have a shortage of them right now. So that's what we as an industry are committed to filling that gap with these various training programs. But Didi, to your point, I do think it's a broader kind of societal effort to ensure that the economy and the federal government support those types of career paths, which are rewarding and well compensated and lifelong careers, but we have to get folks into them to fill that economic need.
And I have to say, I'm very encouraged. So, relative to what I saw when I got into the industry nearly 3 decades ago, there just wasn't a lot of focus on manufacturing skills because we were still working through that glut of very skilled baby boomers. So I'm encouraged. I feel like I was in Little Rock recently and visited a couple of high school training facilities there where kids, as young as 15 years old are learning how to weld and operate CNC machines and things like that. So it is encouraging.
And I was going to add, the example that Charles mentioned of developing the programs of the community colleges and universities around. I mentioned earlier, that prep work today is only going to help you, down the line 3 or 4 months from now, whenever these programs, the federal funding programs become open, because you can have a project ready to submit. So if you look around and you say, this is the skills gap that we have today, we don't necessarily have a training program established. How can I convene the stakeholders around me to develop what that may look like? And whether you have a project that comes in that needs to take, advantage of that, or you don't, I think you can do that work today. And once the program becomes open, you're submitting it. A new project comes to town and you want to submit it together, that certainly would increase your chances. But even if you don't, I do think these are types of programs and projects that the federal government wants to support, where there is that sort of public-private partnership to address the skills gap that they're starting to notice and they know they need to fill.
Do you all envision the increase in automation helping out with the skills gap, or is there still really that larger need to continue to funnel into the overall pipeline?
I think there's a continued need. I mean, there certainly is increased automation on shop floors across manufacturing. That's not a new trend, though. And, going back to my kind of manufacturing skills point, this is what Hunter's talking about as well, and Didi, you need somebody to maintain that machine, right? The jobs may be changing, but the jobs are still there, and we need people with the skills to do that. I mean, that when I talk to companies, the number one job that I hear about is technician, actually, to maintain this cutting edge, incredible equipment, which, by the way, the tax bill helps you buy more of. So policies are already moving in that direction, but we need folks who can maintain and ensure that that machinery is operating to the greatest extent possible.
Yeah, and I was just listening to the other day. I mean, Amazon is laying off 13,000 workers, I believe it is, which, typically we think of AI and automation right now is taking a lot of blue collar jobs, but or I'm sorry, white collar jobs. But also their automation department, they have in Shreveport, Louisiana, they have a warehouse and distribution facility that it's their logistics operations of the future. And they have robots that are basically doing the picking and bringing the items to the packers, as opposed to having people go around and collect these products. And the story is a lot of people could lose their job because of this, because we're going to have robots doing this instead of individuals. So there's going to be other kinds of jobs like technicians, and the people that are doing the picking and packing right now don't necessarily have the skills. Now they might be able to get those skills, but there is definitely going to be dislocation. There are going to be people that lose their jobs, and we saw this when the manufacturing started to leave the United States late in the last century, where people really lost their jobs and weren't able to find other work. Hopefully, at the federal, the local, and the state level, we can do things to help resolve that and address that better. But if you think about the overall GDP picture, right? GDP is a function of the number of people working times their productivity. So if we can AI or robots or automation to make each individual more productive, then we can have a higher GDP with the same amount of people. And if we have immigration, we have people start having children again, and if we have like internal growth, then there's no limits to what we can achieve. So yes, it is a problem that we have to address. We don't have the right skills in the right places, but it is also this huge opportunity for us to continue to develop prosperity in the US.
I want to go back to an earlier comment around the permitting reform that's happening right now. How do you see some of those changes impacting maybe speed to market or even delays? Or what do you kind of foresee as the future with some of the reforms happening? I know Hunter and Charles, you both have been dealing with this a bit on your side.
You want to take it, or you want me to start?
I'm happy to lead off on just kind of what is happening on these reforms in DC. I think, Hunter, you're probably closer to the practical impacts. The way we think about this from a policy perspective is you can have all of the growth incentives that you want, whether that's tax incentives, whether that's workforce training programs, whether that's regulatory changes that are all designed to stimulate investment. But if you can't get the permit to get the shovels in the ground to do the investing, then you haven't actually achieved all that much from a policy perspective. And so we really believe strongly in the need for permitting reform. It takes 80% longer in the US to permit projects as compared to our peers in the OECD. There's state and local and federal, and there's judicial. The various federal agencies all have different permitting processes rather than one uniform standard. So it's just really difficult to navigate. This administration has started to focus on this topic. The EPA just finalized a new piece of guidance that changes their pre-construction permitting standards, so you can actually go ahead and get some shovels in the ground while you're waiting for your final permits to clear, right? the interesting dynamic from the kind of DC perspective is that there's not going to be one big, beautiful permitting bill in the way that there was one big, beautiful tax bill, right? That was all pointed in one direction. We're going to have this EPA rag and that DOE rag and this bill that does these three things and that bill that does those three other things. So I'm sure from the business perspective, that makes it harder to appreciate the reforms that are happening, but they are happening. And the EPA, especially, is sort of considering additional roadblocks to permitting. There's an old Biden era rule about particulate matter in the air that really would have put large areas of the country, including in the Southeast and especially in the Southwest, into what's called non-attainment, because anytime you put a shovel in the ground, there's dust in the air, right? That's particulate matter. And so it would have made it more difficult to get projects off the ground in compliance with this particulate matter standard. This administration is reconsidering that standard, right? Do you call that permitting reform or don't you? I sort of don't care what you call it. It should help companies get investments off the ground, which is a direction that we want to be rowing in. And so, Hunter, I'm curious your perspective on kind of the early returns of reduced timelines to permit, reduced uncertainty on the back end, or are we still kind of waiting for some of that to bear fruit?
I think it's a little bit of both, and it's almost on a project to project basis. From our experience, what we've seen, the Trump administration has effectively said, "You tell us what rules you have challenges with and what those challenges are, and we'll go see what can be done about it, whether it's from a regulatory perspective, legislative perspective." As Charles mentioned, that permitting reform has been a topic in DC every year for at least the past decade, and they still haven't done much of anything on it. This year they've been trying to push forward a permitting reform bill. We'll see what happens, but they can't get the government funded, so I'm not too hopeful that they'll be able to do much there. But the Trump administration has tried to aggressively, with its regulatory authority, especially for large projects or large critical minerals or projects that are considered national security, economic security. You tell us the rules that are a problem, and we will go do everything we can to address them in whatever way we can. We can't tell you what that is today, but we'll get around to it. But they're also using that, sort of making a bank of, these are the reoccurring themes we're seeing with all these projects that are our critical priorities. What can we do about this later? If Congress is able to move something, say next year or 2027, let's make sure that we address these reoccurring themes that are happening frequently. And the other thing I'd say is they have also set up specific teams and authorities within each agency. Now, this is one of those things you got to make sure you're talking to the right person, but Investment Accelerator with the Department of Commerce is a great one. They have, there's that $1 billion mega project type of threshold that they like to consider, but I have heard that they are considering projects that are a little bit shy of that too. So it's sort of the medium to large project scales. But that Investment Accelerator is built specifically to liaise within the various agencies that can address those rules or those issues that the projects may have. Or if you're an EDO and say you don't have a project, but that you faced this issue in the past, how can you identify that as a huge challenge to the economic growth of your area, and raise your voice to the right person to identify that? They are open ears right now to identifying those issues and how can they tackle them, because Trump earlier this year signed an executive order that for every rule they create, they have to kill 10 rules. And they are trying to take that as seriously as possible. It's, again, if you can get your issue or whatever concern you have on that list, there's a chance that it could be addressed. It's just it's sort of on a project to project basis of can you address those rules. Sort of the broader changes, I think we still have to wait and see what's to come based off of this year. What they've seen this year, but I think next year is going to be a huge year for where they're going to make more sweeping, broader changes.
I would just add
Yeah.
one thing, Hunter, to that, sort of on a project by project basis, another resource for folks to consider. There's the administration's permitting council. So they don't really have a policy arm. The sort of Energy Dominance Council is doing a lot of the sort of what should the permit process be. The permitting council, if you call them, they can sort of track down where is your permit stuck, and they are committed to working across the various agencies to unstick those individual permits and individual projects. So that could be a good resource for folks who are sort of stuck in the pipeline somewhere and maybe they're not sure exactly where. That team is designed to do that kind of case by case work.
I'll say in the nearly decade I've been in DC, meetings that we have with the agencies, the level of cooperation and coordination across the agencies on issues like that is something that we've never seen. When we go into meetings with a project, they're telling us who we just met with the day before, what we discussed, what the issues were, and what they can do about it. And so, again, I think that it is a level of how can you we package that up. There's one, they like to do this 1-2 page sort of bullet style. Let's get them, here's the issues, permitting rules we have concerns with, raise those, have to come to DC, have meetings with the agencies, and then the coordination between the agencies to address those problems, really unlike anything I've ever seen, where there's not a territorial grabs of who can address what, but they really are trying to work together to address it.
Yeah, one thing I think I would like everybody to hear this today is that I think there's always been a place for counties and large municipalities or regions to have representation in Washington. I think that has never been more true than it is today because there is a lot of behind the scenes discussions that are happening. And if you frame your needs in the right way, there's not just political will, but there's actually an infrastructure that's being put in place to be able to help deliver that to you. So yeah, I would just encourage any of you to if you don't currently have a lobbyist in Washington, to think about how you can best make use of that. And Hunter, you were talking about, or one of you was talking about, for every regulation you have to get rid of 10. That's like my husband's rule for clothes and shoes that I bring into my closet. Although I think I've settled on like 2. It's like 1 in, 2 out. I would say the air permitting for us, just from a corporate perspective, there's nothing that can impact the speed of development that is on a regulatory side more than air permitting. I think we also have issues with the length of time that it takes for wetlands, a core letter from a JD letter from the Corps, and the ability to delineate or remediate. But air permitting and the inability to begin any construction that has an emission source before you get that permit. I mean, it's like for major projects, we're talking about a year of just sitting there on your hands waiting for them to do something. And then the other thing is the PM 2. I don't know if they're looking at 2.5 or PM 10, but certainly
2.5, yeah.
The PM 2.5 like changed the entire dynamic. I mean, there are so many places that our projects cannot go now because of the PM 2.5. So if that changes, that will be a major boon for investment, and particularly the counties and the communities that are able to compete for that. And then the last thing I really see is like, to what extent do you think like unlocking infrastructure? So it's been very difficult to operate. We have a lot of the critical minerals and resources that we need here in the United States, but it's either technically, economically, or politically infeasible to actually open these mines. The same thing goes with pipelines, natural gas or other pipelines where we've seen they just stall because there isn't enough public support for it, or there's too much public resistance. Are you seeing some of those start to move as well? Is that a focus of the administration?
Short answer is yes. I mean, those are some great examples. PM 2.5 certainly has been a focus of the administration. They've announced publicly they want to reconsider the Biden era rule. The new source review is something they've already taken action on at the EPA. So your lips to their ears, it sounds like, which is great. Certainly, yes, critical minerals and energy resources have been a focus of theirs. The president did an executive order on critical minerals. Folks may be aware that Interior has a list of critical materials, and Energy has a list of critical minerals. I may have gotten those flipped, but they don't perfectly align. And so one of the steps that the administration has taken is to align the two lists so that they can be utilized to drive investment. And certainly we know that the president is focused on getting access to those natural resources. To your point, though, it takes a long time to do that. And so we focused on, well, we still need a runway of access to all those inputs, even while we seek to drive domestic investment in accessing those inputs, but it definitely is an active conversation that's happening among the administration.
Well, we've only got a couple more minutes left and want to leave some time for some of the questions. So just to transition a little bit, I'd love to hear from each of you kind of what's your prediction for manufacturing investment in the US for next year, just given everything that you all have talked through this afternoon. Charles, you want to start us off?
Sure. So I will start as my favorite place is to start with tax. So tax should drive increased domestic manufacturing investment. If you look at the specific incentives in OB3, as we're calling it, one big beautiful bill, you see specific provisions designed to stimulate manufacturing investment. There is a new deduction for manufacturing production facilities. Instead of having to amortize the cost of a facility over 39 years, you can take a deduction for the entire cost of that facility in year one. That should drive investments, right? There is now first year expensing for capital equipment that you're going to put in that new facility or in your existing facilities. That should drive domestic manufacturing investment. There's first year expensing for your R&D costs. Manufacturers conduct 53% of all private sector R&D in the United States. So taking collectively the incentives in the tax code as of July the 4th are clearly driven at domestic manufacturing investment and reducing the cost thereof to allow companies to do more, better, faster, stronger, right? So we should see a bump. The question is, does some of this uncertainty to some of these roadblocks limit the cap of how much investment we see? Tax should open the floodgates. In 2018, we called the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act rocket fuel for our industry because there really wasn't a cap on how much investment it could drive. And we saw those returns in 2018, 2019, and the early part of 20 before COVID. Are we going to see the same floodgates in back half of 25, 26, 27? Or do some of the constraints that exist limit that rocket fuel and not negate it totally, but do we see decreased enthusiasm for some of those investments, given the long-term nature of a manufacturing investment and given the present-day policy uncertainty? To me, that's the biggest question of how much impact can tax and regulatory reform have in a universe of significant policy uncertainty.
I'll go next. I mean, I think for me next year, I think we're going to see even more direct involvement from the federal government in economic development and manufacturing projects through investments, through grants I'll say that in quotes for now. I'll come back to that in a second. Loans, tax credits, everything else. I think you're going to see that more and more throughout the year. I think a lot of headlines, and as mentioned earlier, question we always get is, are grants over with? Are loans over with? Is the federal government just kind of going back to free market? Because of the freeze earlier this year, because of a lot of the cancellation from the Department of Energy, I think they canceled about $15 billion in various already awarded grant funded projects, as well as loan projects from the Loan Programs Office. And that was about 300 projects that got canceled. So everybody's saying, well, is that just no more? I think it's going to be even more so than the Inflation Reduction Act. I think you're going to see it also happen much quicker, where you're going to see deals announced very frequently. And I think you're already seeing some of that toward the tail end of this year. Intel happened 3 or 4 months ago where the government took an equity stake. Now, I think over the past 2 weeks, they've announced 4 to 5 deals. And I think that pace that's now being set will continue throughout the year. But just to give you some numbers to think about, the Development Finance Corporation, which traditionally has only been funded projects ex-US that were either connected or receiving exports from the US, now has the authority to invest domestically. And their reauthorization right now is being considered at about $250 billion. So that's a war chest that the Trump administration can use to invest in projects. You also, through the talks about, I think the OB3, I heard that one, I'm also using that. There's $200 billion in the Office of Strategic Capital within the Department of War. I think they probably use about 20 to 50 of that already. So that's another $150 billion, that the Trump administration can use. And then also through the U.S.-Japan trade deal that was recently announced, There's rumors that there's a 550 billion that will be given to Commerce for them to use to invest in projects through these. And I think that may go through the Development Finance Corporation. Who knows? But you're looking at about $1 trillion in a war chest that the Trump administration can use to make these deals that you're seeing. And I think the other big change is for private sector projects, that these equity stakes are a real thing. I mentioned grants being in quotes. I can't tell you how many times in the past couple of weeks we've been told that grants are over with, no such thing as free money. I think Howard Lutnick famously said, if I'm going to give you the money, I want a piece of the action. So I think that you're going to see a lot of that. And because of that, the federal government's taking more of an investment banking, private equity type approach instead of sort of a venture capital where the carbon captures, the sort of space age advanced metal recycling processes that may not be commercially feasible yet. I think they'll look at some of those things if they're aligned with minerals, metals, the hard stuff. But I think they are going to they're going to take a hard look at what projects are bankable, commercially feasible, that if we have an equity stake, the U.S. government has equity stake in it, that we trust that will lead to a return for the taxpayer down the line. And I think that's going to sift through a lot of these projects that we call them two guys in a pickup truck and a white paper driving around, trying to get investment. But I think, like I said earlier, for EDOs, as the Trump is accelerating his timeline of how the federal government getting involved, how can you prepare today so that if you do have a site that comes calling where those gaps or issues that you already know about, do you have a plan to address it? Maybe you don't have the money for it, but you at least have an idea of what it would look like to address that. And then with this new project that's coming to town knocking on your door, how can you use that opportunity to go to the Trump administration to get funding for it? So that's what I would close off with. I do think there's a huge opportunity coming next year.
Yeah, characterize that as the wild, wild west. When Hunter starts talking about trillions of dollars in the war chest, it makes me wonder, how efficiently will that money be used? And is there any level of corruption? I mean, it's something that we've been able to look back historically around the world. So to what extent does that have an impact on more macroeconomic trends? Does all of that money entering into this space cause inflation? Certainly we have constraints on the power. We have constraints on the sites. We have constraints on the labor. Data centers are exacerbating those issues because they are just like the sucking sound that is, taking up a lot of these resources that could generally, in other scenarios, be directed towards manufacturing. And I think that there is also a concern for me, it's the reliance on the equity markets in the tech sectors. And these are all kind of macroeconomic trends that we don't really know where they're going. So I don't mean to be a wet blanket. I really am saying that I think there is still tremendous opportunities, specifically in sectors and in projects that align with the administration's strategic goals. And if you can take advantage of those, absolutely do that. But I also think that we have to keep an eye on some of these macroeconomic trends to see if there's, could be a negative impact coming down the road.
I kind of wish I'd started us off with this question because I feel like we could go into an additional hour for each of you. But we do have one question I see right now in the chat. So I'll read it off and then we can talk through who wants to respond first. But this question is, to what degree have stricter national security reviews impacted FDI decisions? Based upon your observations, is it discouraging deals, or are those firms just chalking it up to the cost of doing business now in the U.S.? I think we talked a little bit about this earlier. We're certainly still seeing activity within the U.S., some cancellations, some announced projects. Didi, maybe do you have any additional comments in terms of just the overall site selection process and what we're seeing on that side? And then Hunter and Charles, if you both have additional comment as well.
Well, we've definitely seen a more aggressive stance when it comes to CFIUS. But generally speaking, if you're not Chinese, North Korean, Irani, or Russian, you're okay. And there's really only one country that's still trying to do business here in the United States. So I don't see a huge impact from international, certainly not from domestic, but not really from other international investments. I think it's just regarded as the cost of doing business.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think most people think of it as the cost of doing business. I think yeah, it is the anti-China stance. As long as there's no Chinese connection, I think that's what they're focused on. There was obviously a lot in the OB3 that focused on that in terms of if it has Chinese content, you don't receive benefits. I think one thing that is coming down next year is not just Chinese investment or ownership or equity or anything, which has been traditionally the focus of CFIUS, is going to be how much Chinese equipment do you have, or how much Chinese materials, raw materials, construction materials, and what does that look like? We've been told for our projects that they can't buy the equipment anywhere but China because they own 90% of the market in some cases. As long as there's no kill switch or computer or some point that the China can turn the thing off, that's really what they're worried about. But there's really not a standard process of making sure that is the case. Is there an audit firm that comes in and looks at every piece of equipment to make sure that we're good to go? I don't know if that's necessarily been figured out yet, but I do think that is coming. The Select Committee on China Competition recently released a report that identified, I think, 10 to 20 different areas and sectors that they're going to look at to strengthen the protocol. So I think there's more to come on that next year. But as it stands today, I think most people think of it as a cost of doing business. We've just got to go through the review process, and we'll clear it on the other side as long as we're not China.
I think that's interesting, though, Hunter.
That you're talking about, that ladder that you're talking about is more impactful to them than the CFIUS review, because it's not just getting machinery and equipment or raw materials from China. It's really importing them from anywhere in the US. I mean, if you're going to make, if you're going to import, if you're going to Italian company and you're going to come to the US and have, produce prosciutto and all the things that we love on our charcuterie board, but the only place you get that slicing equipment is in Europe. And now it's got tariffs applied to it. That is way more impactful to manufacturers. And Charles, correct me if you think I'm wrong. I see you nodding, but I think that's way more impactful than having to go through a CFIUS review. Yep. I also think it's pretty misguided. There's lots of really high quality Chinese companies that are not state-owned enterprises that are just like companies from anywhere. I'm old enough to remember all the Japan hysteria. And so while this is fundamentally different in some ways, I also think that we should think about how we can be smart about protecting national security without shutting ourselves off from Chinese-based investment, which has leapfrogged in some sectors the rest of the world, either in technology or in their ability to produce. So the world's largest manufacturer of battery separator film is a Chinese company that we helped find a site in Ohio, and they control a large percentage of the market. So until we're able to develop that capability, we're sort of cutting our nose off to spite our face in the meantime.
Well, we are just at time, so I want to be respectful for everyone's time today. We definitely appreciate everyone that has logged on or those that will be listening to the recording later. Of course, any questions that you all have around the information that was shared today, you are always welcome to reach out to any of our panelists directly. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.